Hello, welcome to Washington Talk. I'm Connie Kim. The U.S. continues to say that a summit with North Korea before the presidential elections is unlikely. It says President Trump will only sit down with Chairman Kim Jong-un if there is sufficient likelihood of making real progress on the denuclearization front. Meanwhile, South Korea revokes the permits of two organizations that were involved in the anti-leaflet campaigns, a move that's widely criticized and has potential to be brought up in the international stage. We discuss these and more. Joining us today is Olivia Enos, Senior Policy Analyst in the Asian Studies Center at the Heritage Foundation. Ms. Enos focuses on national security challenges in Asia and human rights. Scott Snyder also joins us today. He's a Senior Fellow for Korea Studies and Director of the Program on U.S.-Korea Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. He's authored numerous books on the Korean Peninsula, with this latest being South Korea at the Crossroads. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
So there has been a lot of speculations on whether this summit between the U.S. and North Korea is going to happen. And we heard Secretary Pompeo said that a summit is probably unlikely because it's already July, but said that a summit could happen if there is going to be real progress on the denuclearization front. So do you think a summit will really happen? Ms. Enos, let's start with you.
I think that a summit before November elections is highly unlikely. I think in large part because who will be the next leader in the US is largely unknown. And I think given the fact that the summit in both Singapore and Hanoi really rendered so little progress, it wouldn't be in the U.S. interest to actually pursue a summit from the U.S. side. But I think North Korea is likely to kind of bide its time, not really sure either way who will take the helm, because if it's another Trump administration, they know that they can get a summit possibly in the future. If it's a Biden administration, they might make assumptions that it would be similar to an Obama administration. So while they don't know exactly who will be in office, they might know what they could expect from either administration. And given that the Obama administration was a lot more reluctant to institute sanctions in many forms, I think that they might even just say, well, either way, we're not super worried about who would take office in the U.S.
Scott, what's your take on this?
Well, I think that a summit is probably highly unlikely, but what's really interesting is that both leaders currently are possibly weak, but need to project positions of strength. And the big challenge is that both leaders need the expected outcome of the summit for Kim Jong-un, sanctions relaxation, for Trump, an actual deal. And yet, the likelihood, given the amount of time left, that they can get the result in place is low. And so I think that the only realistic thing that a summit could possibly accomplish would be a reset or a new start that would then carry over and be implemented in a new administration in the U.S. But we haven't seen evidence of public interaction that would lead us to believe that it's going to be possible to achieve that by October.
Mm-hmm. Secretary Pompeo said there are a lot more talks than is reported, and reportedly Trump administration officials say they are developing new proposals to get a breakthrough in the stalled talks, and administration officials are reportedly developing an idea of a summit that will bring clear deliverables to both sides. So how can we read into the U.S. stance on talks with North Korea?
Some deal very similar to what is being speculated about was offered at the Hanoi summit and summarily rejected. And I think any sort of, step that is lower than the legal standard, complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program, is not a win for the United States. Because at the end of the day, sanctions legally cannot be rolled back unless you meet that high bar standard of complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of its nuclear program. And I think ongoing negotiations just continue to buy time for the North Koreans, for authorities in Pyongyang to continue to develop their missile and nuclear programs, as well as to continue to engage in severe human rights violations, which this administration, at least in the summit context, has been reluctant to raise.
So, Scott, are you skeptical that the two sides won't be able to get a clear deliverable that is good for both sides then?
Well, I think that the best that could be expected would be that both sides make some kinds of concessions that are then characterized as the start of a process, precisely for the reasons that Olivia has laid out, and that is that the possibility of achieving a full-fledged agreement that is backed by implementation that would be necessary for it to benefit Trump politically are quite low. And so for that reason, I think that it's possible to imagine that both sides could pledge some kind of new start involving a set of projected concessions, and probably from a North Korean perspective, a good reason for going that route would be that they would probably feel that they could walk away in the event that Trump lost the election.
Mm-hmm. Do you think North Korea is weighing whether they should come to a summit or not? Because Secretary Pompeo did say that they're getting mixed signals from North Korea on the summit. And Kim Yo-jong also did say that anything could change depending on the leaders' decisions.
It depends on how sweet the package is that Trump is willing to put on the front doorstep of the North Koreans.
Mm-hmm. And I want to now shift our focus to an ongoing issue in South Korea regarding the anti-leaflet campaigns. So South Korea has revoked permits of the two organizations that were engaged in sending North Korea leaflets across the border, and it now says that it's going to look into 24 organizations in the standoff between Seoul and the activists. So what do you make of Seoul's recent moves?
You know, I think this is a bad look for Seoul. This is a bad look for Moon Jae-in because South Korea is seen as a bastion of liberty and of democracy in Asia. And now you're seeing President Moon kowtowing to the demands of a rogue regime that doesn't respect the most fundamental of rights, that has between 80,000 to 120,000 individuals in political prison camps, that silences freedom of speech, that restricts individuals' ability to practice their religious faith. I mean, for Moon to say that a civil society organization is not able to engage in activities to promote information access in North Korea is a huge impingement on the liberties of civil society. And I think to some extent it does reveal the fragility and even sort of the nascent nature or the up and coming nature of the maturity of South Korean democracy when the executive is able to decide, you know what, our civil society groups aren't allowed to engage in these types of activities anymore. And, you know, it may start with these first two groups, but I believe, Connie, as you mentioned, it might potentially expand to more groups. And I think this is a serious concern. And I think South Koreans themselves, whether they care about North Korean human rights or not, should be outspoken about this issue because we know that North Korea has offered false threats in the past, making a big stink about loudspeakers on the border a couple of years ago and intermittently cracking down on individuals who are trying to get information into North Korea. And I don't think that President Moon should be bullied by Kim Jong-un or any authorities in Pyongyang that would seek to limit those freedoms.
Mm-hmm. So, Ms. Enos, you raised concerns about South Korea's latest actions regarding these anti-leaflet campaigns. And Mr. Snyder, we actually see contrasting views from the U.S. and South Korea when it comes to access to outside information. The U.S. State Department says it's going to increase access of independent information to North Korea, while South Korea says that these anti-leaflet campaigns do not improve access of outside information. Would you agree with this statement?
Yeah, I think one of the most unfortunate consequences of the way that this is being handled in South Korea is that, as Olivia has hinted, it opens up the perception of a values gap between South Korea and the United States on the issue of freedom of expression. The alliance and cooperation between the U.S. and South Korea on North Korea is premised on the idea that we have a common set of values. And so there's a real danger that this crack between Washington and Seoul could grow larger, especially if there are perceptions that South Korea is shifting from being a representative of democratic expression to a suppressor of democratic expression.
So South Korea's latest decision is getting a lot of criticism, and in fact, we heard from the Human Rights Foundation president that it's going to file a complaint to the UN if Korean prosecutors indict these two representatives that were engaged in anti-leaflet campaigns. What kind of a wrong message could South Korea send to the international community down the road?
I think that it absolutely sends the wrong message that South Korea does not stand on the side of its citizens, does not stand on the side of freedom to engage in these types of behaviors. And as Scott referenced, and you referenced as well, Connie, the State Department is looking at ways to continue to expand freedom of information in North Korea. And in fact, U.S. Congress took major leadership when it pioneered the North Korean Human Rights Act, which itself has grants that are distributed to both South Korean and American civil society organizations to promote information access in North Korea. So as Scott was saying, it really makes it look like there is a divide yet again between Seoul and Washington when it comes to promoting human rights and when it comes in particular to promoting freedom of speech and freedom of information. So I absolutely think it sends the wrong message. I think it's going to look very bad on South Korea to have U.S. civil society organizations like Human Rights Foundation, who are rightly pursuing measures at the United Nations to get greater clarity and to hold them to account. And so I think this is a move that hopefully they'll consider reversing or at least not expanding to other groups and organizations.
Yeah, I agree. I don't have too much to add. I would just say that as we look forward, there are two issues that stand out. One is that in South Korea, there's been criticism that the U.S. has been funding some of these groups. But honestly, I think that the U.S. government is funding some of these groups because because the South Korean government and because the South Korean civil society has failed to provide the necessary support for these groups. And then the other big question, I think, is going to be how does this play in terms of South Korean public opinion? Because I don't think that the average South Korean wants to see its government as a suppressor of the scope of freedom of expression within South Korea.
Yeah, and if I could just add to Scott's comments on the South Korean government really getting in the way of freedom of information, as I understand it, certain aspects of the Korean government have actually gotten in the way of civil society organizations, for example, using certain wave frequencies that would penetrate deeper into North Korea when it comes to radio services. This is one easy decision that the Korean government could make at any point in time in order to improve information access in North Korea. And it wouldn't even require the flying of balloons in or the smuggling of information, because many North Koreans already have access to technology as it is, whether radios or computers or otherwise, even if, especially in the computer sense, internet access is somewhat limited by the regime in Pyongyang.
If I could just add one thing, and that is that we can debate whether or not leaflets are the best way of disseminating information into North Korea, but I think that we should not be arguing about whether or not there's a need for North Korean citizens to have greater information. And so let's find the best way to disseminate that information to people who need it, and then proceed on that basis.
We'll have to keep a close eye on what kind of additional moves the South Korean government will make on these human rights organizations and whether their stance will change down the road. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Ms. Enos and Mr. Snyder, today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That does it for today's Washington Talk from Voice of America. Please join us again next week for more analysis. Goodbye.